Welcome to this Proofpoint webinar. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the people-centric cybersecurity strategy. And this means how you should be able to make your weakest link your strongest asset. The agenda for today will be cover a few topics such as how do you approach risk, the user as a target, the evolution of attacks, different approaches which will tie into the people-centric strategy, the user as the last line of defense, and how to reduce risk by putting people first, and finally, why Proofpoint. First out, we have a very interesting slide with a familiar quote from back in the days. No astronaut launches for space with his fingers crossed. That's not how we deal with risk. If you reckon this, every astronaut, they train for months and months, and that is because they want to make sure that they can be as prepared as possible for any kind of situation that might happen to them when they are out there. So there is no such thing as keeping your fingers crossed and hope for the best. And this is the same way which we should think about in email security and cybersecurity as a whole. What do we mean by risk in the email space? There are various forms of risks. So the most obvious ones are credential phishing, spear phishing, malware, a particular kind of malware like ransomware. We have business email compromise, enterprise account compromise, malicious attachments, PowerShell scripting, and so on and so on. And what does this mean? Well, the user is the target, and we have to remember that hackers are humans. They are targeting humans, and the exploits or the payloads are activated by humans. In fact, if we take a look at this slide, which on the left-hand side shows you from this Gartner report that the security spending that we're doing today, on the network side, we spend roughly around 60% of the money and roughly about 20% on the endpoint and about 10-12% on web, but only 10% on email. But if we dig a little deeper into that, we can see that more than 94% of all breaches actually starts with attacks that are targeting people through email. So this is a quite interesting number to keep in mind, and it will help you understand and realize why we need to think about cybersecurity from the perspective of the human and the people behind the computers. So is this really something new? No. In fact, if we look at how people have built their defenses throughout time, we can actually look at the Greeks and the Romans that built castles and forts. It was a layered approach with moats surrounding the outer high walls, with watchtowers, and entry points were limited with a retractable bridge, as an example in this case. Inside there were also inner walls to separate different areas, and throughout the entire structure there were guards surveilling and monitoring who would enter in through those walls. So there was an intended strategy to constantly develop and enforce these defenses. And it was really hard for the enemies to enter inside those walls. By breaking the defenses, that was very costly and time-consuming and not really very effective. So you might recognize this picture here. This is a picture of the Trojan horse. So this was a way that the Greek developed, a clever way to sneak in through those walls without being spotted or breaking anything. And what was the method? Well, it was by luring the people with the Trojan horse as the bait that made it possible for the enemies to get inside those walls. So this means that the people was actually the vulnerability. And that is the same thing that we see today with email attacks. Traditionally, we have been very good at building a good security posture around our on-prem environments. The problem we see today that have surfaced and become extremely relevant is the fact that more and more companies and organizations use cloud technologies. This means that not only have we our infrastructure to protect, but also a second infrastructure, the cloud services that we're using. And we get more exposed and more exposed outside of the perimeter of our environment. So if we try to tie this back to our castles and forts, similarly, we have built forts and castles with various layers of protection. So we protect our infrastructure and we strengthen our defenses in the cloud. And we also have to strengthen the weakest link, the people. And that will be the last layer, which is the most vulnerable part and needs to be taken very seriously. So this is the people-centric approach and how we start with that. We know that hackers are humans, and there are various forms of hackers and attackers, I should say. They might be state-sponsored, they could be organized crimes, or they could be just hobby hackers. But usually they are well organized and they are prepared. We see less of botnets, but higher volume, fully automated campaigns instead. And these are very well thought out and advanced, and they are highly targeted. And quite often they also use evasive techniques to avoid discovery, which means they will be very difficult to detect. So, once again, we are targeting the humans. Once again, it is the people we are talking about. The attacks, they are aimed at the people, and this could be through various channels. Could be email, over SMS, or other communication apps, or phone, etc. They usually leverage well-known campaigns, and also they abuse current events that are happening around the world. That makes it more, it's easier to actually fall for the lure. So one example right now, which is the current situation, is around Corona and COVID-19, where we have seen a huge increase in attacks trying to pretend to be uh, have something to do with information around COVID or so on. Some emails and some attacks, they actually try to pretend to be from WHO and so on. And this becomes also a lot simpler now through the adoption of the cloud services, because that is the second most common vector in terms of email, because more and more companies are moving to the cloud. They're using different kinds of cloud services, which means that it's a very, very easy attack vector for them. And what needs to be understood also is that most of the time people are not aware really of what is actually happening and going on. So the third point here, the payloads are activated by humans. More than 99% of all attacks require some kind of human intervention, some kind of human action to be taken. This could be through clicking a link, a URL, or you enter credentials on a website or so on. You might open an attachment, you allow macros, you can accept those security warnings that you usually will see when you try to do that. So what we see is, in fact, fewer and fewer exploits of vulnerabilities. And people are often very susceptible to these types of attacks because they are crafted very well, and especially in the case where there is some kind of reward behind it. You might have recognized and seen those types of emails before yourself, where there is a lure saying, open this email or join this, click this link, blah, 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 and you will get a reward in some form. It's a typical way. The more we know, the less we fear. So how can we use this information that we have? Well, by adopting and using a people-centric strategy, we can better target the true risks of today. And one of the key things is to gain visibility and insight into what is happening in the environment. And how do we start to gain this understanding? First of all, we need to know who is being attacked. And secondly, we need to know how they are being attacked. And consequently, we also need to know what role they have and what privilege and access level do they have. And once we have that visibility, we also need to know where the weaknesses are, or more specifically, who are likely to fall for an attack. And this will make up our list of what we call VAPs. It's the vulnerability of the people and the attacked people and the privilege level of the people. And this will help us answering who are our very attacked people. And that is the message with VAPs. So, who falls into these traps? These users that normally clicks on different kinds of links that might lead to malicious websites where there is maliciously hosted content, or the users that fails awareness training, or sometimes there may be users who use risky devices and risky cloud services. There is where we have the vulnerability. Who is targeted? We can see that some people are more prone to getting and receive a lot more attacks. They are highly targeted, and usually they are very advanced, and they receive large amounts of attacks. So those people will sum up the attack part of this slide. And who poses the highest risk? Well, this is in terms of privilege. So what we can think of here is people who may have access to very critical systems or very sensitive data, or can be a vector for some kind of lateral movement within the organization. So if we combine these three blobs that we see here on this screen, this will make up our VAPs. And this slide here is actually taking from what we call the TAP dashboard. And that is the way that Proofpoint does this by utilizing the intelligence and the data that we have collected, and then which we then present in this TAP dashboard. So this example here is the VAP report, which gives a very nice and simple but detailed view of the current state. We can see who is on this list based on the attack index, what role they have, how they have been attacked, and the volume of attacks, and so on. And this can give us clues to know who might become compromised in the future. So now we know who to protect, and we can do this in various ways. We have three things that we really need to think of in this particular case. First of all, we need to reduce the user vulnerability aspect. Secondly, we need to stop threats and attacks on those users. And finally, we need to be able to apply some kind of adaptive controls to these VAPs for better protection. So examples on this could be, for instance, with adaptive controls. If we have users that are highly targeted, they might have a high privilege, and we know that they maybe have failed security awareness training, or they have been using a risky device, or so on. What we can do is, for instance, if we integrate with an IDP, we can do some kind of step-up authentication, which require them to utilize multi-factor authentication. Or, as an example, we can use isolation to limit the risks of risky web browsing if they are clicking a link that leads to a malicious website, and prevent them also from uploading data, as an example. So in a way, it will be a little bit like a DLP-like functionality in that way. And that can be based on these VAP lists when we know who these users are in the organization. This, of course, is not the only thing that we can do, as everything in the Proofpoint portfolio integrates with other solutions. So there could be additional things like CASB, ITM, zero trust network access, encryption, and so on. But that will be covered in other webinars. So your users are your last line of defense. And what we mean by that is that once we have identified these weak links in the organization, how can we turn them into become the strongest asset? Because at the end, there is no perfect security solution out there. Some things might slip through, and the best way to act on that is to actually have a human behind there that actually can make a decision on that. Let's say, as an example, an email have slipped through and you realize that this might be a phishing attempt. Then you should have the possibility to report that, for instance. And that makes you effectively the last line of defense in that way. So to sum this up a little bit, fingers crossed is not a strategy. We need to work and prepare and continuously expand on this. And we need to do a continuous training. We need to continuously monitor this, give visibility, and adapt our policies and tune everything around this continuously. So, as we mentioned, you remember the astronaut in the beginning? There is no astronaut that launches for space with his fingers crossed. That is not how they will deal with risk. And we need to do it in the same way with cybersecurity. So if we have a quick look at the Proofpoint portfolio, it is based totally on the people-centric strategy. So on the upper left-hand side, where we have the threat protection part with email security, advanced threat protection, orchestration, and so on, email fraud protection. This gives you the protection across the key people-centric threat vectors. Then, of course, we need also to have some kind of controls to make users more resilient against threats. And that's where we use browser isolation and zero trust access. There is also other forms. How do we prevent data leakage? Prevent the data that is sensitive, or in one way or another, we don't want that to leave the organization. And that's where we have encryption, DLP, we have insider threat management, and CASB. Finally, compliance is also a very key thing in this. We need to be able to be compliant for a complete enterprise risk visibility. And that sums up this people-centric webinar for today. So I thank you for watching this and hope to see you again.